Okay, so welcome to the Spring Seed webinar from the Organic Farmers Association. We have three speakers today: Julie Dawson with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Jared Zystro with the Organic Seed Alliance, and Dylan Bruce with Driftless Seed Supply. Next slide. So maybe you want to know, like, who is, well, we have an agenda for today. Who is the Organic Farmers Association? And Julie's going to talk about seed breeding for organic systems. Jared is going to talk about trialing seed on your farm. So if there's some organic varieties that you are unfamiliar with, that you'll learn how to trial those out. And then Dylan Bruce will talk about growing organic seed for your own use or for sale as another enterprise on your farm. And we'll have some time for questions. Next slide. So who is OFA, the Organic Farmers Association? Next slide. We are farmers from across the United States who work with us on identifying issues of importance to organic farmers. We do a lot of advocacy work and we also do technical assistance. So feel free to get a hold of us and we can answer a lot of different questions. And especially if you're having any government issues, or we've helped people with bankruptcy when their buyers went bankrupt and trying to get their money and that sort of thing. So we do a lot of different things to help farmers. Next slide. We also have work groups where we talk about certain things. We have an NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service work group, how to work better with them. The National Organic Standards Board, when they have their biannual meetings, we work on what they're going to be discussing and come up with our public comments. Import fraud for the grain world has been an issue. We've been working on that. And crop insurance are our four work groups right now. They always are changing depending what the issues are. And we've actually had, there's going to be a bill introduced in Congress about organic import frauds and doing some testing. And we've had some good luck with improving crop insurance for organic producers through our work group. Next slide. We also have these farmer circles where the next one coming up is next week, March 20th, where we'll be talking about cover crops, where farmers call and just discuss various things, different topics over the year. So you can either scan that QR code or just go to our website and you can sign up and everything's free. Next slide. So now this goes over to Julie.
Great. Thanks, Harriet. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to do this webinar. Excited to talk about organic seeds and how you as farmers might get more involved in ensuring that there are appropriate and well-adapted seeds for all of the crops that you might grow. One thing about organic systems that I really enjoy working with them is that they're very diverse in their cropping systems, in their markets, in how they approach different management and quality aspects of different crops. And that means there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to seeds either. I think that organic systems present us with an opportunity to work more directly with farmers to ensure that varieties really do meet the needs of each farmer in their particular environment and market. Next slide. One of the things that we've tried to do as an organic seed community is understand what might differ between organic systems and conventional systems in terms of growers' needs. This slide shows the results of a survey that Organic Seed Alliance and UW-Madison did together. This was a few years ago now. We really reached out to a lot of direct market growers who are in organic systems across the country. We got responses from many geographic areas, kind of weighted towards the northern tier, but pretty dispersed. You can see all the different points where responses came from there. And we asked them what traits they would need to know something about before they tried a new variety on their farm. What was the most important criteria for them when they were picking new varieties? And one thing that came out was that there are many things that growers would like to know. Flavor was ranked the highest, and it was followed very closely by disease resistance and yield. And then after that, by days to maturity, earliness, kind of the length of the season. And then after that, there were a number of other traits related to quality and adaptation. And I think that's one thing that we see, particularly in direct market systems, but in organic systems more broadly, is that this attention to quality is really important. And the variety first has to have quality, and then also needs to have all the production characteristics. And some of those production characteristics, like disease resistance or pest resistance, might be more important in organic systems where there aren't chemical remedies to be used, where the system has to be designed to prevent those problems rather than having access to remedial action when you already have a problem. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about two brief examples today of organic seed needs that resulted in an actual breeding project to meet those particular needs, and how you might get involved in either encouraging these types of projects to exist or to actually physically and organizationally get involved in actual on-farm breeding. So the first one is grains, and the second one is vegetables. With grains, we were seeing that organic farmers in the upper Midwest needed varieties that were more able to compete with weeds and had high quality for artisan markets, particularly baking. And baking often requires high protein, which is difficult to get in a winter wheat. But a winter wheat is far easier to grow in an organic system than a spring wheat, which is what is usually used for bread making. We also needed strong disease resistance to something called fusarium, because that is a food safety risk. So we were trying to select for a winter wheat that was cold hardy, that had really good vigor, outcompeted weeds, and had disease resistance, as well as having really good quality for artisan bread making. Next slide. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but what I want to give you in this slide is an idea of the complementarity of more of a formal university breeding program and the on-farm farmer engagement and engagement of end users. When you start a breeding program, usually any breeding program, you might make some crosses between varieties that have complementary characteristics. In this case, we took varieties with really high quality from France that were historic varieties, but well known for bread making, and crossed them to winter hardy winter wheats in the Northeast that had tested well in organic systems in the Northeast. And once we make that cross, you advance it to 2 generations, and that is called the F2. So it's the second filial generation. You don't have to remember that terminology. And that's where you see a lot of diversity. Every plant is an individual. It's very different. And you start making selections, and you can't select for yield or for bread making quality on an individual plant. So we started by doing some selection for disease resistance and for protein and for winter hardiness. And as the years continued, we were doing selection in organic systems on research stations with many, many small plots. And then once we got to the point where we had a few that were looking good for those traits that we could see in earlier generations, we went to on-farm trials as quickly as possible. And this was with a number of farms. We had, at that point, 6 lines. This is the purple block over to the side. We worked with a farmer in New York, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So Wisconsin was the Wet Kings at Meadowlark Organic. Illinois is Harold Wilkin and Janie's farm. And then in New York, it was Tor Oshner at Oshner Farms in Preeville. And we really then wanted to get a better sense of how that performed on farm. And at the same time, we started testing with actual professional bakers who were doing artisan baking. Next slide. The benefit of the research station is that you have a lot of equipment for small plots. We could do hundreds of little plots. We could spray them with fusarium and select for disease resistance. Probably not something you want to do on farm. But if we're working with organic farmers, we can actually bring farmers to the research station and start evaluating these small plots in a way that reflects their needs without having to put 200 plots on an organic farm. And Pablo Sandro is a grad student, recently graduated, who ran a lot of this particular project. Next slide. As soon as possible, we went to on-farm trials. So this is a photo at Meadowlark Organic. We planted large strips, tried to get good yield data, good data on winter kill. And then the benefit of these larger plots is we were also able to work with bakers. Next slide. We had enough grain to really mill and then test in a bakery we ended up with about 40 bakers across the Midwest and Northeast, testing the most advanced lines to ensure that they actually made really good artisan bread with a winter wheat that was a slightly lower protein content than the typical winter wheat, but a much higher protein quality. And so there we were able to develop a winter wheat variety, which is going to be out this year, we hope, for farmers, that hopefully meets kind of the particular needs of organic farmers. And farmers were involved in the priority setting process, in the actual testing process. And then we also engaged with bakers who are not necessarily a typical audience for plant breeding programs, but were really important in this case. And so with this variety, we hope as a farmer, you get a better product, a better variety for organic systems than you would by just using the best possible conventionally bred variety. Next slide, please. So the other example really quickly is with vegetables and particularly with tomatoes. In the vegetable world, it's really an exciting time to be involved in organic seed breeding because there are a lot of small regional companies that are really trying to target organic systems and direct markets. There are a lot of breeders that are working independently that know a lot about their crop. And this can be a little overwhelming as a farmer because, like, where do you start in evaluating all of these different catalogs? It can also be a little overwhelming as an independent breeder because most of these breeders don't have access to the testing networks that a larger company might. And so that's where it's really important for organic farmers to be involved in the actual process of developing new varieties. Next slide, please. This was a partnership between a number of different organizations, and we hope that it can start creating this model for other independent breeders to engage more farmers in actually testing varieties, so they have the data that they would that normally would just be for a bigger seed company, and farmers would have a lot more engagement with the actual variety development process. So this is UW-Madison SeedLinked, which is a platform for participatory trialing. We worked with Organic Seed Alliance, and then we had two different independent breeders from Nature and Nurture Seed and from KC Tomato. We had funding from the Organic Agriculture Research and Extension Initiative, which was really important to having this project work. And actually, the wheat breeding project was also funded by the Organic Agriculture Research and Extension Initiative. Next slide, please. The idea with this is really to give more information to breeders and to speed up the process of getting a variety from the initial cross to the actual availability to on-farm, to farmers to buy or for on-farm trialing. Instead of having the breeder evaluate the varieties on their home farm for 5 or 6 years and then send it out for trialing or try to get it into a catalog, we're able to actually, through the SeedLinked platform and the collaboration between the university and the breeder, get 20 to 40 growers to start testing this only a couple years after the cross was made. So here you see the same terminology, F1, F2. F1 is the first year after the cross, F2 is the second year after the cross. That's where you have the most diversity and where it's most important to get feedback from organic growers. So here we're looking in this tomato project for excellent flavor, good field performance in the upper Midwest in a saladette type tomato. And normally it would be several years before we were able to test it on a lot of sites like this. Here we got feedback right away. Growers selected and gave feedback on their favorites. And then we multiplied that in the greenhouse and really doubled the number of generations we could get per year, which shortened the timeline from actually having this idea that this variety was needed to it is actually commercially available this year, 2025, through Nature and Nurture Seed. Next slide, please. So Nature and Nurture Seed started this project as a way to get a open pollinated version of Juliet tomato. And we've got one that is called Jada now, that is striped Juliet size. And then the other project, which followed a similar trajectory, is Keith Mueller at KC Tomatoes, looking at a smaller cocktail size orange tomato with the flavor of like a sun gold cherry tomato, because that quality is really the most important thing for organic growers. And then building in disease resistance and yield and performance after that is critical as well. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show this. I think this is the last slide, or the next to the last slide. The network of growers participating in these trials is growing every year. And so if you're interested in getting engaged in actually testing new varieties, you should check out the SeedLinked website. And also, if you are interested in just looking at what other people have trialed and what people have to say about those varieties, this is a great place to get information. Jared's going to talk some about how to structure a trial on your own farm. And you can also join these other trials and be part of a network of growers that are all testing the same types of varieties to find good replacements for conventional varieties or develop new varieties that meet our needs better. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Jared there.
All right, thanks so much, Julie. So as Julie said, there are a lot of opportunities to participate in trials, whether with universities, with trial networks like SeedLinked, but oftentimes there may be trials that you would like to conduct on your own for your own farm's use. So whether it's because you're considering engaging in plant breeding or seed saving or seed production, or just because you're trying to find a really good variety that is meeting your market needs or addressing a particular production challenge, being able to conduct a trial is a really helpful tool to have in your toolbox as a producer. So I'm just going to really briefly go over some of the basics of how to plan and execute a variety trial that gets you useful information that will allow you to make good choices for your varieties for your farm. So the first piece is thinking about, just as you're planning your trial, what do you need to be thinking about? Generally, there is benefits to conducting a trial, like trials on all of the crops that you're growing, but nobody has enough time, land, labor, etc. to be able to test out all of the varieties that they may want to trial across all of the different crop types. So I would highly recommend the first step in having a successful trial is having one that is meeting like really a priority need for you. So thinking about the crops that are either one of your kind of major market crops that you grow, and it's really important to find the right variety for, or thinking about specific challenges, whether it's a disease that's been moving into your area that's been affecting your production of a specific crop, but really kind of thinking about what are the goals of the trial and what are the crops where you will see potentially enough value in completing the trial that you're going to be able to take and be willing to take the time that it takes during the season to manage a trial while you're doing all the rest of your production. So once you've kind of identified some goals, you've prioritized what crops are really important for you to conduct a trial on this year. There's always other years for other trials. Then thinking about what are those varieties. And next slide, please. So I guess kind of taking a step back, and a few key things to think about in terms of having a successful trial. One is making sure that you understand what your goals are. We'll talk about that a little more later, but and then another is setting up the trial in a way that at the end of the year you can feel confident that you're seeing genuine genetic differences in the varieties and not just differences due to differences in the field. And we're going to talk about that in a little while. But then, first and foremost, you need to ensure that the varieties that are going into your trial, that you are looking at enough varieties and that those varieties are likely, hopefully, that within the batch of varieties you're including in your trial, that some of them will actually be likely to meet your needs. So how do you do that? Many of you already have strategies for how you source your varieties and select your varieties just for commercial production, but those same principles might apply to what you would include in a trial. So this might be thinking about, okay, what are some of the really, for a given crop, what are some really important commercial varieties in your region? What are other growers in your area? What are sort of the standards that they're using for commercial production? Looking a little more broadly, what are the most popular commercial varieties of that crop type available nationwide? What are some of the top sellers out there? And then I often would suggest considering including some older, what we call like standards, in that varieties that have consistently been available in catalogs that are grower workhorse varieties for many, many years. And finally, thinking about including, if you are doing any of your own on-farm seed saving or plant breeding, making sure to include those in the trial as well. Next slide, please. So to the next step here, when we think about what constitutes an effective trial, ultimately what we're trying to accomplish here is to, if you grow a trial and at the end of the season, you want to feel confident that you are, that the varieties that look good or perform well really are performing well or performing poorly because of differences in those varieties growing in your environment. And what you want to think about is, how do you set up a trial in a way that minimizes the kind of lingering questions you might have at the end of the season where you say, well, I'm not sure if this variety really was better because, it just happened to be in a really fertile part of my field, or this variety, unfortunately was on the edge close to like there was like alfalfa that was being cut, and like a bunch of, insect pressure came in from the edge of the field and affected that variety. So trying to set up a trial to kind of have consistent field conditions. We're going to talk about this so that so as much as possible, the environment that the trial is being grown in is consistent. So what you're really seeing are genetic differences. There's other strategies to do this. One is to, and we'll talk about this more in a second, to replicate the trial so that you, instead of planting one variety just in one part of your trial, you might plant that same variety in more than one place, so that if it looks good or looks poor in multiple places, you're feeling more confident that that variety is genuinely performing better in your conditions, rather than it happened to being a part of your field that just happens to be more fertile or less fertile. Likewise, some other tips and tricks here. If you can, try to use a border row or put your trial in the middle of an existing production field. So if you're growing, lettuce, just putting that in the middle of a bed that's already being planted to lettuce with additional beds of production on either side. Again, with the idea that so often kind of the edges of our fields experience different effects than the middle of our field. They might be spots that are getting a little bit of compaction from tractors. They might be spots where the irrigation isn't quite reaching, or they might be spots where where your manure spreader like makes a turnaround and applies a little bit extra. So if you can avoid the edges of your fields, again, it's going to give you more consistent and clear differences that are based on the differences in genetics. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about like how do you score those traits in a second. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about this, but the idea that one strategy, and this doesn't always have to be something that you need to do or necessarily have the capacity to do, but one strategy that I often would recommend is if you can replicate the trial, which means that instead of just growing a single plot of each variety, you would grow each variety in your trial in multiple places. So in this example here with this, with these beets, there's 5 varieties here, numbered 1 through 5 is what this map is showing on the right-hand side. But you can see that variety 1, for example, is planted in 3 different places in the field. Same thing for variety 2, 3, and so on. And the idea again here is that if for some reason the far that close left-hand corner is there's some kind of strange field conditions going on there, well, rather than only seeing variety 1 in that corner, you can see it in 2 other places of the field and see, okay, well, how does it look in these other spots as well? And I can tell you so many times, having gone in trials, and when you look at just the first replication, you would see, oh, wow, this variety is doing great. But then when you start to look at it in the other places in the field, you start to realize, oh, maybe there was just something about that location and not that variety. So having this replication and this randomization, which means like shuffling the varieties around randomly in the field, can really help improve your confidence in the results of your trial. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I mentioned, one of the key things here is kind of trying to minimize the amount of environmental variation that you're experiencing, or at least trying to account for it. And of course, as we all know, most of us farm on ground that has variable soil conditions, variable kind of microclimates that are happening. So in addition to using the randomization and replication that I mentioned earlier, just thinking about where your trial is going to be situated on your farm is a really wise thing to do. So if you, for example, have, a field that's in, hay or cover crop or a single crop, it's a great opportunity to kind of get a sense of like, okay, what are the field conditions here? How much variability am I seeing? Are there some really low kind of poor growing patches and some really lush patches? Well, this looks like a variable part of the field. Can you find a part of the field where there seems to be relatively consistent and uniform soil conditions, where all of, if you're growing a cover crop, everything's more or less at the same height and looking, equally healthy? That's a good spot to put a trial. Next slide, please. The other piece of consistent field conditions is on the management side. So how are you treating this field? And so I would say with a trial, again, keeping in mind that goal of feeling confident at the end of the year that the differences you're seeing are because of varieties, you want to manage your trial uniformly so that you are irrigating everything the same amount at the same time. If you're trying to compare differences in varieties, if you're doing a trial that's like want to compare how things perform under different irrigation, sure, that's great. But if you're trying to compare varieties, make sure that you are controlling all of the other variables as much as possible by having, uniformly watering, cultivating uniformly. So this would mean don't weed half of your trial 1 week and then wait 3 weeks later to weed the other half. Well, now you've created this, difference in terms of the weed pressure that some varieties experienced. Same thing with fertilizing, same thing with harvesting. Try to really do any management that you're doing to this trial the same way and at the same time throughout the trial. Next slide, please. The flip side of this, I just would like to emphasize, is it's really like, don't be too precious with your trial. You still want to manage this as close as possible to as if you were growing this for commercial production, because at the end of the year, you want to again feel like you don't want to be sort of questioning yourself and saying, well, this variety did well, except we did all of these special things to baby the trial, so I'm not sure how this would have really performed for us. Try and make it as close as possible to how you actually are going to grow that crop, and that's going to give you a much better sense of how this will perform for you when you're scaling this up to production scale. Likewise, a lot of times you'll really see the differences in varieties when there is a bit of stress, really active, kind of and careful, cultivation and management of your trial. You may be able to kind of prop up some what my old mentor John Navazio used to call prima donna varieties that would only perform with ample fertility and lots of inputs. If that's not how you normally farm, don't grow your trial that way. If there are specific stresses that you really want to see, try and think about how you set up that trial in a way that demonstrates those. So if you really want to see, okay, how do things perform for a really early, cold spring planting? Well, make sure you're planting things in a point where they're experiencing that. If you're expecting, concerns about, drought tolerance, don't water things that you wouldn't normally be watering, and so on. Next slide, please. So how do you lay out a trial? Generally, this can be relatively straightforward. You can, let's say you have 5 varieties. You can either start by making a map and saying this is where these 5 varieties are going to be arranged, and then measure it out. So each of these stakes is representing a single plot, meaning it's planted with a single variety in the trial. You'd like to have your plots be the same size, laid out the same way. So you can either make the map ahead of time and then put your stakes out based on that map, or you can, it's not an uncommon thing to do, is just go ahead and label your stakes, randomize them right then and there, and then put your stakes, measure out your stakes, put them in the ground, and then plant based on what your stakes say. What I would say is this: make sure that if you go that way, if you're sort of making your field, putting things based on where the stakes are, you need to go back and make a map. It's really easy for flags to get torn, for stakes to get broken, for the Sharpie marks on those stakes and flags to wear off in the season. So go back and make a digital or physical map. I would recommend having both. It's really nice to have the flags or stakes so that when you're walking the field, you immediately know what you're looking at. You can just look down and see, but having that backup map is key. Next slide, please. So how do you evaluate this trial? There's a few different things to think about. One is, are you going to be actively measuring things versus scoring? And I'm going to talk about what that means in a second. And then how are you timing your evaluations? So what I mean by that is that it really matters. You want to think about what's the most useful time to actually measure. Let's say, for example, if you want to know how plants do, let's say corn, how does it do in terms of like early season cold soil emergence and vigor? You need to see that early on during the initial germination, emergence, and first few weeks of growth after that, because a lot of times things can kind of catch up later in the season and kind of even out, and maybe you'll see it, some subtle differences in the ultimate yield of your variety based on how something, whether or not something had good, early emergence and vigor. Or, you may have noticed, during cultivating how it was much harder when you had these really weak plants during your, during the early season. But if you wait too long, you don't want to have to go back and remember how something performed at a specific time. So thinking about the timing of things. Okay, when does it really matter that I'm scoring disease on these trials? maybe you don't need to be scoring it really late in the season when you would have already been kind of turning those crops in. Think about it, when it matters. So timing matters. And then let's go to the next slide. So measuring, this is one strategy and can be useful for things. So this might be if you want to, this is an example of looking at ears of corn, trying to say how long are they? How wide are they? How many rows do they have? Some of that may or may not matter to you. Sometimes measuring is the easier way to go. So maybe something like yield is a great example. How many, totes of tomatoes were we able to harvest out of this? And you can think about what is a relevant and useful kind of unit of measurement for you. You don't necessarily need to be counting like individual cherry tomatoes, for example, if that's not something that you ever would do during harvest. But think about, okay, how would I measure this, and do I need to measure it? Because the other way you can do things, next slide, is to score them. And what I mean by this is rather than having a absolute number like pounds or inches, this is just rating something, just giving it your own individual arbitrary score. In this example, I'm suggesting using a 1 to 9 scale, where you have 1 just being really poor for a specific attribute and 9 being the best. Typically, as humans, it's hard for us sometimes to find small gradations. So some strategies for scoring things is first to actually walk your whole trial and kind of look and find like what is the worst thing in the trial and call that a 1. What is the best thing in the trial and call that a 9. And now you've kind of started to orient yourself to like the scale of differences that you might be seeing in that trial, and start with the odd numbers, so that you then if you really start needing some wiggle room, you say, well, that thing wasn't as good as that 9 that I saw, but it was better than this other one that I called a 7 for, I don't know, for dark pigmentation in my leaves. I'll call this one an 8. So going ahead first by setting your scale at the extremes, and then coming back and walking the trial, and then scoring things. Again, often starting like with the odds, and then as you get more refined, you can go in between the odd numbers. Next slide, please. So what traits might you be evaluating? Lots of things. One thing I would say is limit yourself in terms of the traits that are actually important to you, because it's really easy in the winter or spring to be really ambitious in your trial. And then when summer season gets busy, you don't want to have given yourself a bunch of extra make work that doesn't actually give you information that you care about. So limit yourself maybe to 5 traits at most, would be my recommendation, and think about what those are. Some examples here: plant height, stature, days to maturity, what's the yield, what's the harvestable yield or marketable yield, what color am I looking for, what's the depth of that color, flavor, texture, storage life. These can all be traits that you might evaluate. In addition to sort of these being these typical traits, as an organic farmer, there might be additional ones. Next slide, please. So things like, as I mentioned, like seedling vigor, especially in cold weather, pest and disease resistance, competitiveness with weeds, if you've got specialty markets, if it's meeting kind of specific kind of culinary criteria, if you're working with chefs on it, is it resistant to drought or heat or cold? Next slide, please. So at the end of the season, how do you make sense of all this? If you're using the SeedLink app, it does a great job of distilling a lot of this information and combining it with other growers. I really would recommend that if you're doing that on your own. First, I'd say Organic Seed Alliance. We have some great tools, including a booklet on conducting your own trials, as well as some trial evaluation tools and templates that we have. But essentially, what I would look at if I was evaluating a trial. First off, I forgot to mention 2 really key things that you want, 2 extra things that I would say to include in your data collection are taking photos of anything that you want to make sure that you're going to recall later. And a lot of times the easiest way is like take a photo of the steak so that you've got the name, and then take a photo of the plant so that it's just like boom, boom, right in your camera roll. You know what plot it was, you know what the photo is. And write notes. Numbers alone don't tell you, they tell you some things, but they're missing a lot of nuance. So make notes, make comments, remind yourself what the heck you're seeing, thinking about yourself reviewing all this come fall or winter. But when you're looking at the data, the things I would look at is first off, what is sort of the average? So like this is like top height in this example. So in this case, this is for, we cared about this because it helped with weed competitiveness and the ability to cultivate more easily. And so we would look at the average. Okay, what are some of the ones that perform the best on average? Well, Scarlet Nance, had a 7.3 average. So did, Bolero had a 6.3. These two both had pretty high average top heights. The other thing I look at then is like, okay, this says rep 1, rep 2, rep 3. So reminding us again that this means that we planted these 5 varieties of carrots. Each variety we planted in 3 parts of the field, and we recorded that data separately. So like when we look at Bolero, we can see it had really tall tops in the first part of the field in rep 1, and also had really tall tops actually in rep 2, but then in the third part of the field we planted it in, if you look at Bolero rep 3 there, it says it only had a 3 out of 9 for its top height. So the question becomes, what happened there? Was there a reason why that replication had really poor top height? And that's where notes can really be helpful, and also can be helpful in discerning, like, is that something that's going on with that variety, or was there just something particular to that part of the field? And that's where having both, looking not just at the averages, but looking at those individual plots can really help you, especially if you took notes. So at that point, I'd like to pass it over to Dylan, who's going to talk a little bit about growing your own seed.
All right, thanks, Jared. Yeah, variety trials have been a really critical tool for us, both when we were CSA farming, being able to tap into the regional variety trials to help guide some of our production choices, and then now utilizing that SeedLink platform as a small seed company to be able to effectively trial our varieties. And it's really easy to see something on your own farm and want to make decisions off of that, and it really helps to cut through the noise of the weather and year-to-year fluctuations to have those distributed trials. So my name's Dylan Bruce. I'm one of the co-founders and primary farmers with Driftless Seed Supply. We're a relatively new seed brand focused on the upper Midwest, but have been growing seed on contract for other companies you would be familiar with for about the last 8 years. If you can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm on the left there with my wife, Sky, and we founded our farm in 2018. And on the right is my business partner, Cody Egan, who farms about an hour away in southern Minnesota. If you can go to the next slide. Going to go over some really basic information about seed production, try and steam through things since we're a little low on time here. One of the most important things as you're thinking about producing seed on your farm is to understand how it's pollinated. And so we have sort of 3 main types of pollination. One is self-pollinating crops. These are things like beans, peas, lettuce, tomatoes. We also have insect-pollinated crops, so many flowers and other fruits like cucumbers and melons and things like this. And then there's a little bit of in-between space there of things that are self-pollinating but are facultative in that they could be pollinated by insects and often are. So that's things like peppers. And then there's things that are wind pollinated as well. So this is mostly grains, but also spinach, beets, chard. In the Midwest, of course, our corn belt. Go ahead to the next slide. And when you think about those different mechanisms of pollination, that's going to determine how you keep the variety pure or isolate it from other varieties or crops of the same species. So it's important to keep in mind that within a single species, there will be many different market classes. So a great example of this is squash. The Cucurbita pepo species includes things like pumpkins, jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, pie pumpkins, summer squash, acorn winter squash, etc., or brassicas as well, have a lot of different market classes. And so you want to keep things true to type, so you need to isolate it and make sure that only that same variety is cross-pollinating within the population. So there are several things you can do to isolate things. One option is by time. So in the Midwest, because we're surrounded by corn, if I want to grow a corn crop, my best option is to offset my planting dates so that the silks on my corn don't overlap at all with the tasseling of a neighbor's corn crop. You can also isolate by space, so just having sort of physical distance in between the crops to reduce the chance for cross-pollination, or physical exclusion. And so in the example of these pictures, you see a pepper which is self-pollinating but can be cross-pollinated by insects. And so since it can self-pollinate, we're able to put it under this insect exclusion netting and still get a seed crop. Go ahead to the next slide. So for the examples of the crops I put up earlier with the pollination types, for things that are very strongly self-pollinating, like peas or lettuce, when we get a seed contract for seed production, we'll typically see an isolation requirement of 10 feet on the low side to 50 feet or 100 feet for some tomatoes. Things that are insect pollinated and wind pollinated, it depends a little bit on the surrounding landscape. And so for something that's insect pollinated, if we're in a very forested, very hilly, lots of different flowers in between other growing areas, it might be as low as half a mile. Or if it's a more open area, it might be up to 2 miles. And then for wind pollinated crops, 2 to 5 miles, sometimes more. You really just have to know your prevailing winds and what's upwind of you. Go ahead to the next slide. So another foundational aspect of considering seed production is understanding seed maturity. And the best thing that you can do to understand your seed maturity is to cut open a crop and look at the seeds inside, and cut open the seed and see if it has a little white germ inside. So some crops will be ripe at market maturity, things like the cherry tomato or that lemon spice jalapeno. Other things like cucumbers or the Hungarian hot wax on the left are going to need more maturation time than market maturity to get to their horticultural maturity, their seed maturity. And so just getting to know the crop, if you've ever grown cucumbers and missed one in picking, and at the end of the season when the foliage dies back, you find this yellowed, crackled behemoth hiding in the mulch, the mature crop is very different than when you'd pick it for market. But like Jared was talking about evaluation earlier at key periods of the crop, you still need to be looking at that crop. Even if the seed is mature much later than the market, you still want to be looking at it at that market maturity stage, so you can tell if there are off types or there are individuals in the population that look wrong for what the variety should be, or just that you want to select against because maybe they're an individual plant that's more prone to disease. And removing those is called roguing, and it's often a requirement of a seed production run. Go ahead to the next slide. So a few examples of market-ready crops with mature seeds would be things like watermelon, tomatoes, winter squash. So when you pick those at market maturity, most of the seed will be ripe and viable. In most of these cases, you can also push the ripeness a little bit later, or with watermelon and winter squash, you can give it some additional curing. And that additional time will basically let the last bit of seeds mature, or the seeds to just absorb as much energy from the fruit as they can. And you can also think about how you might harvest for seed as different than harvesting for fresh market. So in the case of tomatoes, for instance, because we're not eating them, we're caring about flesh quality, once we've assessed that all the plants are acceptable for the population, for the variety, we might only pick once every week and a half and put them in, chuck them roughly into a bunch of buckets and put them in our cooler until we've picked another round, and then we're processing them. So you can, just because they're ripe at market maturity doesn't mean that you have to treat the crop the exact same as you would for fresh market. And in most cases, there'll be some differences, which I'll get to a little bit later. Go ahead to the next slide. So then there's examples of things, I already mentioned some, but cucumbers, eggplant, and then of course things like brassicas or lettuce, where it has a whole nother part of its life cycle beyond its market maturity. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about two different types, broad categories of seed production. Go ahead. So we often separate things into wet-seeded crops and dry-seeded crops. So wet-seeded crops are things that are, again, usually maturing on the plant, and the fruit will be fleshy and contain the seeds within it. So in the case of tomatoes and all wet-seeded crops, the first step is going to be extracting that seed and freeing it from the pulp. So that often just means grinding up the fruit, or on smaller scales with cucurbits, you might be scooping out the seeds from the interior of the fruit. In certain crops, like tomatoes and cucumbers, there's a step of fermentation required because the gel around that seed contains enzymes that inhibit germination. So you ferment it for a couple days, a few days maybe, until it's got a nice, beautiful mold cap on top of it, which signals that the fermentation is reaching its end. And you can, go ahead to the next slide. You can rinse out that seed, and with a lot of rounds of water, we use about a 1-to-7 ratio of pulp mixture to water when we're rinsing our seeds. And you do that over and over again until it looks like the right side, where the water is clear and the seeds are looking clean. Go ahead to the next slide. Plop it onto a screen, get it nice and spread out, and dry it down as quickly as possible without additional heat that might cook the seed. Go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to talk about dry-seeded crops next. Sometimes these are contained in pods or little flower bulbils, and sometimes the seeds are exposed like the center. Go ahead to the next slide. Again, you have an extraction step. So with dry-seeded crops, this is often called threshing. So you're going to be breaking apart the seed. Oftentimes, you want to make sure that you are picking the crop early enough that it hasn't shattered or dropped its seed before harvest. And that might entail laying things out on a tarp to further dry down. Just have to really watch the forecast so it doesn't get rained on while it's sitting out there. And then threshing can be as simple as stomping on it or beating it with a stick, and you can really do pretty large production runs that way. Or you might have some specialized equipment like a combine or a belt thresher or something, depending on your scale and the target crop. Go ahead to the next slide. So I'm highlighting this for the dry seeding crop, the process of winnowing, where you're separating the chaff from the seeds with air movement. But you also will usually do this for wet seeded crops after they dry as well, to separate immature seeds or the dust that comes from deburring tomato seeds or things like that, removing the fuzz. This is also a crucial step for improving your seed quality and the germination rate. Go ahead to the next slide. And you kind of go back and forth between screening and sifting. So screening being removing, letting good seeds fall through and keeping big chunks of chaff or stem, and sifting being catching the good seeds and letting little particles and dust fall through. And you'll go back and forth between screening and winnowing, and screen and winnow and screen and winnow until you're happy with your crop. And if you are growing seed for use on your own farm, it might not matter if there's a bunch of chaff in there, and you can just sprinkle it into your planting trench or areas, and it's no big deal. But if you're trying to create a saleable seed lot, this is a very important part. And this will often help you remove non-target seeds or weed seeds from the seed lot that you're trying to capture. Go ahead to the next slide. And when you get done and store it, the most important thing is to be very, very certain that it's dried down, and before you put it in an enclosed container. And a really good strategy can be to hold things in paper bags, and we often use multiple layers to ensure that the bag won't break and the seed doesn't spill everywhere, but those are still breathable. And so if you're not really, really certain that your seed is dry enough, paper bags are a great route to go. But once it's really dry, it's nice to put it in an enclosed container. Many seeds have a relatively long life if they're stored in the cool, dark, and dry environments. And we use a rule of thumb that the relative humidity plus the ambient temperature should be less than 100. So if I'm storing it in my basement with a dehumidifier cranking all the time, and it's 50 degrees and 40 relative humidity, 90 total there, that's okay, could be better. And so we have a dedicated walk-in cooler that we keep at 35 relative humidity and about 38 degrees. And it's nice when you have that type of environment to put it in a more tight container. I should have said maybe not the most important thing was drying. The most important thing is to label it. And you should do that at all steps of the seed production process. And as soon as something is on a tarp or in a bin, I have way too many bins of mystery onion seed and flower seed and little breeding projects in my garage, and we have to grow all those out before we figure out what they are. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. I just wanted to mention, a little bit of reasoning behind growing your own seed. So, one thing is that you can create a more resilient supply for yourself. You can create something that helps something adapt to your farm specifically, and micro adaptation like that is definitely very real and can improve your production over time if you're keeping the seed lineage disease free. And sometimes you might be growing out a tomato and find a random off type that is super cool and delicious and productive and disease resistant, and you should save that off type and try growing it again and developing your own little strain of something neat. And then also, there are certain crops that can dovetail very well with fresh market production. There are some things like the brassicas, cucurbits, peppers that are a little bit more difficult because of that isolation requirement. But other things like tomatoes or arugula, maybe even if you have a disease-free crop and it's doing well, it's pretty easy to keep a pure seed lot of those ones, and it's not very hard to get enough seed for your own use. Also, just a plug to support regional seed companies like ours that are really focused on your specific region and what performs well there, and the traits. For us in the Midwest, humidity and cold tolerance are really important, and that's going to be really different from what's important in the Intermountain West or the West Coast or other regions. So the emails for myself and my co-founder there. Maybe flip to the next slide, please. And I just wanted to mention a few other resources. So there's the Organic Seed Alliance website has a lot of great things. A foundational book for us is The Organic Seed Grower by John Navazio. More so my quick reference is The Seed Garden by Jared here and Michaela Cawley, and that just has a lot of good kind of tables of crops with the isolation requirements and what diseases of concern might be, or what the right screen size is for it, things like that. Mark Lutera, who invented the Winnow Wizard machine that you see on the right there, his website, he just published a really nice guide with a little bit more nitty-gritty of seed cleaning, so what the process might look like, how many times you screen it, what does a rough thresh look like, etc. And then we found that a great resource is just your local antique farm equipment club, because they'll have for one, small equipment that's appropriately sized, and old knowledge that might have been lost in the sort of mainstream farming community about cleaning these different types of seeds. Because, every little county used to have a seed dealer or seed house and some seed production, and now we've lost a lot of that to consolidation. But that knowledge is still out there if you go find it. So that was a really quick and dirty. I will say, if you're interested in growing seed commercially as an enterprise, if you're in the Midwest, go ahead and reach out to myself or Cody. And if you're in another region, we can help guide you to another smaller, more regional seed company that might be interested in working with you. Or if you work closely with a seed rep at your favorite seed company, just ask them about it. And folks are usually pretty approachable. And just keep in your back pocket, what are your favorite crops to grow? What are you really good at growing? Because the crops that you know really well are usually the best ones to start with for seed production. So, okay, I ran a little long there, Harriet, but hopefully that's okay.
No, that was great. Oh my goodness, so much information. Starting with, what's going out there, in the breeding, organic seed breeding, all these great characteristics, and the trialing. I had to smile, Jared. I grow bedding plants, and so I have to trial out everything that I sell to my customers every year. And I am out there diligently making my maps in the springtime so I can keep track of which are the first tomatoes that actually produce tomatoes, and then do they keep producing through the season, and all of that. Writing it all down really, really helps a lot. And then, of course, in the end, it seemed a little bit overwhelming, Dylan, but for somebody who does save some of her own seeds, it really isn't that much. I mean, you're not. I am not doing 5-gallon buckets of seed. I just have my little half-pint jars, and ferment my tomato seed, and then I put it on little paper plates and let them dry out. And I have like a piece of tape that goes from the jar to the paper plate and then onto the plastic bag.
That's right, yeah, and that's what I meant with, starting with things like your little bit of tomatoes or arugula seed or your favorite flowers. It's really pretty low-hanging fruit, so to speak, to do some of those things and dip your hand in. And then once you start saving seed, you're not going to stop. You're going to get the bug, and then you're just going to grow more and more seed.
Well, and it's another way too to maybe be able to afford to buy more organic seed by then growing some of the seed yourself, so you don't have to buy those varieties. So out of your seed budget, you have a little bit more money to put towards purchasing, some of these great varieties. I'm very excited about these new wheats there, Julie, because I like to make bread. So we are, I think, at time. We don't have a lot of people asking questions, but feel free to get a hold of me on or any of our. I'm sure you can Google people and find their emails. If you have questions, if you're watching this as a recording. And I guess it's a beautiful day here in the Midwest in the middle of March. Of course, it's going to snow next week, but that's what happens. So I guess I'd like to say thank you to our 3 speakers, and what a great journey this was today through, what organic seed, and just, like I said, let's get the bug and save our own seeds. So thank you, everyone,
Thank
and
you.
have a
Yeah,
great
thank
day.
you.
Yeah, and then, like I said, this will be recorded, and yeah, so check it out later and pass it on to others.